What skill changes the structure of your brain is the question that I will answer by the end of this show. Hello, and welcome to the second episode of The More You Know Mondays. The more you know, the more you grow. This week on the show, I'm going to be talking about the Winter of Discontent. And already with the name, I'm sure there's a lot that you have to say about it, and there's a lot that I want to say about it. But before we even get into that, you know what we have to start with. We have to start with our Monday affirmations, because we have to start off the week right, we have to start it off with a positive vibe, because it's the start of the week, and sometimes it feels like we needed another day on the weekend, a 3-day weekend, as we were talking about the 3-day week last week. A 3-day weekend would be perfect. And when I say a 3-day weekend, I just mean if there was a way where we could insert a third day into the weekend, so that we still had Monday to Friday, but then we just had Saturday, Sunday, and fun day. I don't know what the third day would be called, or how we could put it in the calendar, or how we could slip it in there, but maybe we could slip another day in there and we could call it a third day for the weekend. Anyway, that's another delvage into my mind, but anyway, let's go on to the quote. So the quote for this week, or this episode, or however you want to take it, goes like this. Just because it's not what you were expecting doesn't mean it's not everything you needed right now. And this quote is by Paulo Coelho. And I probably butchered that name, but the spelling of how it's all spelled and his name and everything will be in a post that I post maybe on Tuesday on the My Opinion Means Nothing Instagram page. So if you're not following that, make sure you follow us at My Opinion Means. But I think this quote is really interesting and I take it in heed, because it's really quite motivational to me. It makes me think about my failures and how I shouldn't just see my failures as, man, I failed at this, let's forget about that thing, obviously I'm bad at that. No. Maybe I need to just work harder at it. Maybe I just need to train better. Maybe I need to look at the situation differently and approach the whole thing in a different way to better achieve my tasks. Just because it doesn't go the way you're expecting, you need to expect the unexpected in life, because things don't often go the way you plan them exactly. They never go that way. You can plan things to a T, and there will always be something that goes wrong, or something that you maybe forgot to do that you didn't realize that you missed from your checklist, or do you know what I mean? So for me, I see failures as lessons, way-ins that I can better myself or my surroundings to better achieve what I want to achieve. I also think you shouldn't neglect the second part of the quote where it says, doesn't mean it's not everything you need right now, because when you get to that place of failing or not achieving something in the way how you expected, it's very easy for you to go into a place of why did this go this way, or no. Don't why in anger, why in question, because why is a question, but I just mean don't why in anger in the sense of why me? Why did it not work this way? Like, yes, ask those questions, but question it in a way of, in how am I going to do better next time? Don't be so mad at yourself, because you don't know how things are going to go until you try them and do them. There's a great brand out there called Nike, and they have a slogan that says, just do it. And I agree with them. If you have an idea or a thought or something that you want to try, just do it and see what happens and see what comes of it, instead of just sitting on your hands and thinking that the phone's going to ring when you ain't put nothing out there to make the phone ring. But anyway, that's the Monday affirmations. I hope you've enjoyed them. And let's get into the Winter of Discontent. Now, this is a mad topic because obviously last week I was talking about the 3-day week, and that was around in the UK in 1973 to 1974. And now the Winter of Discontent was around in the UK between 1978 and 1979. And it's an interesting time because there was widespread strikes. Like, it started just in the private sector, and then later it spread over to the public sector, in the trade unions, and basically they were just demanding a greater pay rises than the limits that the Prime Minister at the time, James Callaghan, and his Labour government had imposed against the trade unions Congress. And I think the main reason for it is they were trying to control inflation. Not that that's an excuse, but I mean, I'm not in government, but it seems that the government seem to have a really hard time at times to controlling things when things are, how do I say them, crazy times. They really have a hard time getting a rein on these crazy times. Everything always seems like the government will never get a handle on things. And it always feels like the little people like us are the ones that always seem to have better common sense than the people in charge. But anyway, let's talk about some background around the times before we talk about the Winter of Discontent, like we did in the previous episode. So for the backgrounds of the Winter of Discontent, I want to talk about a brighter time before we get into the darker times of discontent, you know? So I'm not sure how many people are actually aware, but the comparisons kind of came up more so around 2018 when we had that really, really hot summer. But I don't think it was anywhere close to the summer of 1976. Now, if you're a young person like me and you're listening to this, you probably don't know about the summer of 76, but if you're from Britain as well, so I would say ask your parents about it, because I was asking my mom about it, and she just said to me, it felt like summer went on forever. And I know, with that statement, you'll be thinking, summer goes on forever anyway, but and you'd be right, summer does go on forever. There's 3 months of summer, but imagine if from the start of summer to the end of summer, it was just hot, 30, 31, 35 every single day. And there was no rain. At least sometimes we get a little bit of rainy period between the sun, to spread it out, because, things dry up. But these guys in 1976, they actually had a drought, to the point where let's start with this. So, facts, this was crazy. So, in 1976, the British Isles, or the UK, had the second hottest average temperature since records began. So try and fathom that. So that's like that was the hottest summer in 1976 for like, what does it say? For more than like 350 years. So for 350 years, they had never had a summer that hot in the UK. And not only that, like what I was saying, it was one of the driest, sunniest, and warmest summers that they had in the 20th century. So summer is like June, July, and August. And they had a drought. So it's crazy, this drought that they had. It was so bad that on August the 6th, the UK government enforced an emergency power bill, which they announced on the 3rd of July 1976, but didn't actually come into force until the 6th of July. And it was the Drought Act of 1976, which not only banned the use of hose pipes, but also it reduced or even turned off domestic and industrial supplies of water. So that means you didn't get water in your house anymore. Like, they had to install stand pipes, which are like, do you know, like those fire hydrant type things, and they have a lever on it that releases the water, and they would have one of those for every 20 houses. But this was only in some districts. This might not have been everywhere. And this is when it really got to the worst of things. Like, I read somewhere that it said, like, in August of 1976, it got so bad that they were looking like they had, like, about 90 days of water left in London and about 80 days of water left in Leeds. And the slogan around those times was "Save water, bath with friends." But you laugh and I laugh, but you can imagine, like, times must have been real. Like imagine reservoirs were like drying up, and we talk about like end of days. Like, that must have been kind of looking like end of days, because like water is something that we don't really think about as much because it's always there. You know, like, if you need water, you can go to the fridge. I'm sure most people have like water in the fridge, or you can go to the shop, you can grab a bottle, or there's water in your tap. So like, it's one of those commodities that you wouldn't think about it being missing, but if you didn't have water, there would be so much you couldn't do. And especially if water was being rationed, like, you couldn't maybe have a bath when you wanted to, because you had to go out. If you were in a certain district and it had a standpipe, you'd have to go outside to the standpipe, fill up some cartons full of water, and then take those cartons back to the house, and that would be you for however long. Like, you would have to ration that water. Imagine it was only 2 cartons per house, so maybe you couldn't even wash every day. Maybe you had to ration when you could wash. So for me, just thinking about that, that's a mad concept. That maybe 50 years ago, there was a time where water was scarce, and they were come to a point where they had to enact a drought bill, a drought act even, so that they could ration water so that the UK could survive. And as I think about kind of comparisons, there's a part of me that thinks about this comparison of how things could get to that point again now. Like, I don't know. For me, when I was growing up, I remember winter being so much colder than it is right now. And summer wasn't anything. We didn't really have much of a summer. we would be lucky if we got a week of sun. But since I've been an adult, I remember these hot summers, like the last couple of years, like summer's been so hot, and then the winter on the other end has just been so mild like it is right now, and it makes me feel like, could there be a possibility that the same kind of things that were happening back then could be happening again now, and could we have a drought again in the next couple of years? Is that a possibility? Because, as I was saying, even with the Monday affirmations, like, our failures should be lessons. Not saying that the things that happened back in 1976 was a failure, but it's a thing that, like what's happening now, no one could fathom it happening until it happened. And then while it is happening, we need to now think about how we can prevent anything like this from happening again and affecting us so badly. And like, you can't really plan for the unexpected. You can only hope that you can put enough in place for future generations so that they are able to weather a storm against future tides. But like I said, you can't really plan for the unexpected. The unexpected just happens, and then you have to deal with it, and it's how you deal with it, which is what we're judged on, really. And I think it's kind of also important to look at more so the effects that the summer of 76 actually had on Britain. Because it's not just, oh yeah, it was hot, yeah, we could enjoy the sun. But also it had like lasting effects on like wildlife and farms. Like if there's no rain, then like how do you expect crops to grow if there's so much sun? And if there's just crops, if there's no crops that's grown, then how, what is there to harvest? And you can't feed the people if there's all this sun, you know what I mean? So it affects, like, it's great, the sun is great, but you need a balance of sun and rain. But one of the other important things to imagine or think about is just the effects of reservoirs, lakes, ponds, wetlands, all dried up. And even some sections of rivers even dried up. That means that thousands of fish would perish. Many birds died as well. Just imagine like going for like a summer's walk along, I don't know, like in Mile End somewhere, along where, you know, where the reservoir is, and you're walking along there and you just see, instead of seeing the houseboats like floating in the river, you just see the houseboats on the ground and there's just no water. That's mad. So it would be as if the tide had gone in on a beach, but just for rivers and ponds and reservoirs everywhere. It would be crazy. Or it must have been crazy, I should say, because this actually happened. I'm thinking about it, and when I'm saying it, I'm saying as if, like, it's a thought or an idea that could have happened. No, this actually happened. And let's go into some more crazy facts from the 70s. So I was looking into some more other facts. So did you know that Stephen King made his debut as an author during the decade of the 70s? In fact, he released his first book, which hit the shelves in 1974, and the name of his first book was called Kory. Also within the decade of the 70s, he also released his big novel, The Shining, in the 70s as well. And I also think it's a fun thing to mention that though his first debut book came out in 1974, within 2 years they had the book the film for the book out in the theaters. So imagine that you're a brand new author, your book hits the shelf in 1974. It's a hit from the moment it hits the shelf. Everyone's buying it. Then 2 years later, you've got your first movie for your first book that you've just released. That's no wonder Stephen King is so successful. Like the first time he touched pen to paper and created his first story, it was a hit. From the moment it hit the shelf to the moment someone picked it up and they read it, they're like, whoa, this guy knows how to write. Anyway, another fun fact from the 70s is that in the 1970s, it was also the start of the Earth Day celebrations. So the first ever Earth Day took place at the start of the 1970s, and the aim of Earth Day is to help encourage people to learn more about the world around them and how they may impact on the environment. And it's funny that, not funny because obviously this is a thing that everyone should do, learn more about the world around them, and figure out ways on how they can impact and better the environment. And it's fun that they started thinking about this in the 70s, and now several decades later, we are still maybe just getting a foot in that. So that tells you something a little bit about change in human beings. It takes a while for things to really get in motion, but if you don't start it, then there's nothing to go in motion for. Like BLM, for example, if no one started that, then it wouldn't have been able to go in full force this year because no one would have started it back before, so there would be nothing to continually fight for. Speaking of continually fighting, I think is another interesting fact that we should mention. Not even interesting, most people should be aware of this, that the legendary boxer Cassius Clay, better known as Muhammad Ali, would wow audiences and become the self-proclaimed greatest of all time when he had his fight with Joe Frazier in 1975, which was an iconic moment known as the Thriller in Manila. Now, there's a clip that I will drop after this where Muhammad Ali just, like, when I found it and I listened to it, I was like, yo, he dropped some real facts here. He's an amazing man, and he has, he's very particular about his words. Or he was very particular about his words. Because he passed away on the 3rd of June 2016. R.I.P. Muhammad Ali.
I don't think that there's no heavyweight alive who couldn't beat me. I know there are none alive. And when I say greatest, I mean only boxing. See, in the Islamic religion, we have a saying, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar means God is the greatest. So I'm not God. I'm just the greatest in the sport of boxing.
Muhammad, in the book you come over as a deep thinker, not simply a boxer. Is that how you'd like to be remembered?
That's a good question. I am a deep thinker, but I don't think deep at various press conferences promoting fights. You have to think small in order to reach the average people. So I gave the people what they wanted. This is no jive. He shall fall in 5. He will fall in 5. If he don't fall, I'll leave the country. They buy tickets and line up for miles. Is he gonna fall in 5? Well, see, man desires to understand that which he cannot understand. First, he wanted to know what was on the moon. He spent $10–15 billion for 2 rocks. Now, he don't want to know what's on the moon no more. Now he want to know what's on Mars.
Okay, now let's talk about the Winter of Discontent. And again, before I go into it officially, though I am still actually talking about the Winter of Discontent, I want to talk about the fact that I found it interesting that there is a speech in Richard III by William Shakespeare that starts with the phrase, "Now is the winter of our discontent." I will actually, it's a really long speech, but I will read maybe the first couple of lines. So this is from Richard III and it's spoken by Gloucester. "Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this son of York, and all the clouds that lord upon our house. In the deep bosom of the ocean buried, now are our bows or brows, bound with victorious wraiths, our bruised arms hung for monuments, our stern alarums changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures." And that's what I'm going to read. But if you want to find this poem or this speech which starts, "Now the Winters of Discontent," make sure you search for it. It's by William Shakespeare and it's in Richard III. But let's talk about the Winter of Discontent, which happened in the UK between 1978 and 1979. Now, it was a really tough time for the Labour government at the time, which was run by James Callaghan, because, like I said at the start of the show, he was having a bit of trouble with the trade unions and controlling inflation, and there was also, like I said, this backdrop of them having the coldest winter in 16 years. So imagine, like, 2 years prior to this, you've had the hottest summer for 350 years. Then 2 years later, while there's widespread strikes and crazy levels of inflation, like the previous years when I was talking about the 3-day week, like, nothing's really changed. It's only been a couple of years and the inflation rates are really still quite high. So basically, the inflation rates had reached nearly 26.9% in August 1975. So the government at the time had announced a wage rise limit, which would be £6 per week for workers who earned under £8,500 a year. And this was announced on July 11th. And the Trade Union Congress General Council soon voted in favour of the proposals. So there were further limits on pay increases which were proposed by the government through 1976. And in 1977, around July time, it was announced that free collection bargaining between employers and unions would be slowly phased back in. Which wouldn't have been too bad, but the problems come where by 1978, like, inflation had kind of more than halved. So the trade unions were kind of hoping that the government would just take away the limit altogether. But instead, the government introduced this new wage limit, which increased wages by 5%, which was obviously rejected by the trade unions, who weren't expecting it, but like 5%, they were expecting it to just be cancelled altogether. So it's kind of interesting to think about, really. And another interesting thing that I think that we should touch on during the Winters of Discontent is, while obviously there was a crazy battle between the trade unions and the government, and obviously the inflation, there was actually meant to be an election that year. But the Prime Minister at the time, James Callaghan, decided to, and obviously the government, they decided to push the elections back to the following year, so 1979, which was the year that Margaret Thatcher came into power. But I think it's an interesting point to mention because, interestingly enough, did you know that the UK was meant to have their elections this year, but obviously because of the pandemic and everything that's happened, Boris Johnson and the government have decided to push the elections back a year to 2021. And who knows what could happen. Hopefully we get a shake-up of something different, because I don't want another 4 years of Bojo. Sorry. But let's just go over something I said previously. £6 a week. Can you imagine? So think about what the national minimum, what's it called? National minimum wage must have been. Can you imagine? Like, if you're getting £6 a week, what you get in an hour? And this is the problem that the trade unions had. They believed that they wanted to be paid more. They deserved to be paid more, and they wanted it to be a standard that a week with 35 hours, and they would get a 25% pay rise instead of the measly 5% they were being offered by the government. And until they agreed, they went on strike, which is what they did, and till they got their matters heard. And there's a very famous quote that was put in the Sun newspaper at the time, where James Callaghan is very adamant that nothing is even wrong. Nothing's going on. He even goes as far as to deny that there is mounting chaos happening in the country. And he has this very famous line, like I said, that was quoted in the headline in the Sun newspaper that says, "Crisis? What crisis?" And I just find it funny that everyone else in the world, not in the world, in the country can see that there's something happening because they're living in it, and you want to be in your, I don't know, glass house as the government official being like, well, I don't think there's a problem, so let's calm down, people, because there's not really a problem going on. Don't speak down to us as people. We can see something's happening, so you better acknowledge it. Otherwise, there's going to be a change in government, and that's what happened, unfortunately. Labour lost all their seats, and then it was another run for Conservative. And I read a report or an article about how they believe that this was the beginning of the end of Labour, the Winter of Discontent. They believe that this was kind of the first step of Labour's downfall, which is kind of reflected in the fact that it's after James Callaghan and Margaret Thatcher takes over, the Conservatives would be in power for 18 years before we would see the likes of Tony Blair in 1996. And that's bizarre. You see, it's bizarre, but then at the same time, it's kind of very reverent of British people, because if you wrong us as government, and you're in any position, like look at the Liberal Democrats when they went in a coalition with the Conservatives, and that was in 2010, and that was David Cameron and Nicholas Clegg, and we were expecting the Liberal Democrats to hold up on their side of the bargain and what they were pushing for, and because they never had enough seats that in Parliament, they weren't able to get everything done the way they wanted to do it, because every time they would put something forward, I guess the Conservatives would be like, bam, not on my watch. So from that moment on, we've kind of lost so much hope in the Liberal Democrats that I don't see them ever, like, kind of resurfacing from that, or it will take a very long time before they could make a comeback. Because never say never, anything is possible, and we don't know what the future holds. So it's very funny that James Callaghan was saying crisis, what crisis? And it's even funnier that how he was dealing with the strike and the aftermath of the terrible storm that the UK had, with it being so cold and rain. He was in the Caribbean, and although he was attending a summit with the US president at the time, Jimmy Carter, the German Chancellor, Helmut Schmidt, and French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and I'm pretty sure I butchered that name, and I'm really, really sorry. But he was swanning off in another country in the Caribbean, instead of in the country sorting out what was happening, which is, obviously, it's no surprise that he then got Labour chucked out. But if you think about it, I really want to kind of look back and thank the people that stroke is what's the plural? No, I don't think that's the right word. Striked back then. Back in the 70s, the guys that striked, and they were striking for wage to be right, and us to have the right pay rates. I really need to thank you, because if it wasn't for you guys, we would not be having the pay privileges that we have nowadays. And they were just fighting for a minimum of maybe £60 a week. They were fighting from £6 to 60. That's all they wanted, man. It shouldn't have been too hard. But like with most things, unless you're, I guess, in it, you don't know how hard things are until you're there doing the things. So, I mean, although it's easy for us to judge, we don't know what the full constraints of being in government are. Not that it's an excuse, and I'm sure it is possible, but it's just something to think about. Along with the Winters of Discontent, because they had strikes, they had chaos, they had snowstorms and crazy weather, and by the end of January, there was probably about 90,000 Britons who were receiving unemployment benefits, which, if we compare to now and the crisis that we're going through with the pandemic, we probably have many more than that who are on furlough. And that's one thing I worry about, kind of how the economy is going to bounce back from this. Are we looking at maybe a possible recession that could be coming? Is there going to be a drought sometime in the future soon, in the next couple of years or so? Is the economy going to crash? Let's hope not. But these things from the past are kind of like good omens that we should look at, but be warned about, because although it's happened and we've got over it, it could always happen again. And though by the end of things, the government did manage to have a proposal for the trade unions that they could accept, and they were able to agree, and there were no more strikes, but it took a while, and everyone had to compromise in areas which could make things better for them, and to keep the country running, really and truly. And that was the main thing of it. It was cold, they had mad storms, mad strikes going on, and everything was so crazy that they had to wind it in, make things work again. Which is hopefully a point that we'll get to again with everything that's happening with the pandemic. And although us being in lockdown, it's crazy and it's hard, there will be a time when we get back to normality in some sort of way. I just had a flash and thought about how mad, like, the underground might have been in 1976 during that crazy heat wave. So, and I'm also thinking about it because post kind of 2020, 2019, any kind of times before that, like, it would be normal for the underground or trains to be packed and people be squashed up against other people, and that was normal. And now, 2020 onwards, like, thinking about that, I can't even imagine something like that. That kind of freaks me out, imagining all those hot bodies against you. I mean, you need, without social distancing, no masks? Like, that sounds crazy to me. But another crazy thing is the answer to the question that I posed at the start of this episode. What skill can be used to change the structure of your brain? And fun fact, that skill is learning. Yep, learning. Learning is the skill that changes the structure of your brain. It's a crazy thought to think that something that we only usually do at the beginning part of our life, and then we kind of don't usually do as much in our later life because we're not forced to study. We're not forced to learn. Like, although it's not a forcing thing in school, you have to want to be there to learn. But school is kind of like the workforce of your young life, and not workforce as if you're working, but like you spend most of your time from 9 to 5 in Monday to Friday at work. And it's the same with school, although it's, I don't know what hours are they at school? 8 till 3 or 3:30 or 4 o'clock, but it's still the same kind of concept. It's about 8-9 hours with a little break in between, so about 6 maybe, but you're still at school for the majority of your life before, and then when you become an adult, you're at work for the majority of your life. So nothing really much changes between from adolescence, from young life to being an adult, but like the structures or the foundations change of what you're looking at. So I find it to be an interesting fact that learning is the skill that changes the structure of your brain. And it's actually interesting to know that someone who is like me, like a creative, I'm always learning new things, and people who are athletes, they're always learning new techniques and stuff like that. So that changes the structure. Even people who are like musicians, people who learn to play a new instrument. When you learn to play an instrument or you learn a new language, you're changing the structure of your brain. And it's kind of like, the funny thing that I found was in this article that I read, it said like, it was mentioning how scientists until recently have only just found out that our brains still develop past when we become adults. Before that, they believed that our brains stopped developing when we became adults. And I think that's crazy. Can you imagine? Like, what do scientists do all the time? Like, I know science isn't an exact science, but you man really thought that our brains stopped developing when we became adults? Our brains are like supercomputers, and you'd think that would stop developing. Nah, it's always growing and changing, I'm sure. But no more do they believe that. There's been recent data that has shown that our brain continues to change over the course of our lives. Cells grow, they form connections with new cells. Some stop talking to others, and it's just nerves, and that's nerves shifting and changing is how we learn. So basically, to put it in layman's terms, what I mean by when I say learning changes the structure of our brains is that it rewires our brains. So the brain is obviously not just this big blob of tissue that's in the top of our heads, or not even in the top of our heads, confined within our skulls. Like I'm saying, it's a supercomputer, our brain. So if you weren't aware, like, it's between 6 to 7 weeks is when the brain starts developing inside a human embryo. And at that point, in 6 to 7 weeks, it's already started, like, creating different parts of the brain. So, did you know, not even did you know, these areas such as the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is the area behind your forehead, which is why it's the prefrontal. It's not the front, it's the forehead is the front, so it's prefrontal, it's just behind the front. And the prefrontal cortex, that's the region of your head which solves problems. And then there's the visual cortex, which controls sight and sound. And then there's another part deeper in your brain, which is called the hippocampus, which helps store memories. And it's also interesting to know that the cortex is just the outer layer of your brain. So let's put this in layman terms again. I'm pretty sure I've said this already. But when you learn, your brain organizes and then reorganizes itself so that you're able to use different parts of your brain to learn at different times. Maybe that's very hard for you to understand. It's hurting my brain and my head just saying it, but hopefully that makes sense. So when you learn, your brain organizes and reorganizes itself so it's in a different position, so that you're looking at things differently through the new rewiring of your brain, which allows you to be more open. So I found a lot that while I've got back into learning and studying, I had like kind of a drought in my creativity. I found it, I was so oversensitized that, or even overwhelmed to my surroundings, that I found it hard to actually write anything. But as I got back into learning and centered myself with the learning, my brain restructured, I assume, and it allowed those pathways that weren't able to connect again. And I was then able to create new things and come up with new ideas and write write more content. But if I didn't work on the first step of being me and rewiring myself, I wouldn't have been able to propel myself forward. But yeah, I will call this the end of the second episode. Thank you for listening if you got this far to the end of the show. I know it was a little bit of a jumbled one, but hopefully you kept the gist of where we were going on the winters of discontent and the summers of 76. And also, if you have any ideas of things that you want me to look into, I already have a whole selection of things, topics, people that I'm going into through this whole series of The More You Know Mondays every week. But if you have anything that you want to know more about and you want me to look into, I'll definitely put it on my list to check it out. So drop us an email, myopinionmeans@gmail.com. And if you want to get at us on social medias, make sure to hit us up on all the social media platforms at myopinionmeans. And yeah, if you enjoyed the episode, share it with your friends. If you listen on Apple, make sure to give us a rating, because that really helps the show out. If you listen to this as a podcast, audibly on YouTube, make sure to give us the thumbs up and like and subscribe. Oh, and drop a comment, because that also helps. But yeah, Thank you for listening, and goodbye. Oh, and before I go, next week I'm going to be talking about... Actually, I'll let you wait until next week. Bye.